So I'm going to try and condense the talk to try and get us back on time. So I will speak a little faster. Please raise your hand if I'm speaking too fast. So first I want to talk a little bit about the way we approach solid waste management in the United States. We primarily look at the priorities for what is necessary. So the first priority is to protect the human health and the environment. So we believe that protecting human health is done by ensuring that you have efficient and reliable collection. And so that was one of the first things that was accomplished by having large, dense populations, urban populations with efficient collection that would take the waste away from those population centers. The second priority then becomes to protect the environment. So we need to ensure that the environment gets protected, and how do we do that? We do that by having landfills. So not open dumps, but ensuring that we have waste well-managed line systems with leachate collection systems and landfill gas management systems. And then the final priority is to try and conserve natural resources. And this is where all the other aspects come in. You have your recycling, you have composting, and waste conversion technologies. So we believe the priorities go in that order. However, if you have ever seen the waste management hierarchy put out by the EPA, it almost goes in the opposite order. The initial priority is focused on source reduction, and then after source reduction, then you prioritize recycling and composting. Energy recovery is third, and then finally you have treatment and disposal, and that's where the landfills come in. So it seems that if on your hierarchy, landfills are the lowest in the hierarchy for how you want to manage your waste, then it would also seem that it would also be the lowest on the priority. But that's not true. You need to make sure you protect the environment first, and that is done through landfills. So let's look a little bit internationally. The United States is that dark red, and it's not because we colored it that way, it's because the UN colored it that way. We generate more waste than just about anybody else in the world. There are some island countries that generate more than us, and that's usually because of the high amount of tourism that they experience. But you also have to consider waste composition. So the UN also looks at that. If you look at high-income countries, the waste is largely paper and cardboard as the primary component of your waste, with the second amount being biomass. As you go to middle-income countries, 43% is your biomass, and then low-income countries have about 2/3 biomass. This is really critical in determining how you manage your waste. If your waste is primarily biomass, this is not something that's easily burned, and incineration and waste to energy are not practical solutions for those countries. Okay, a little bit hard to see. So hopefully Carlos will be able to get some of this information to you. So this is looking at a bunch of OECD countries, including Brazil, in the amount of food that they have in their waste stream. So apparently the Czech Republic has the highest percentage of food, making up 62%. And then if you look at the bottom here, Iceland is at the bottom with only 10%, although I think that other category probably has a significant amount of biomass. But in general, a lot of OECD countries come in about 30%. Brazil is close to the top at over 50% biomass, and that should help decide what strategies you're going to employ in managing the waste. So how does the U.S. manage its waste? Right now, the U.S., over half of the waste ends up at the landfill. There are no open dumps really left in the United States, so these are sanitary landfills, but this is the primary way that we manage our waste. About 25% is recycled, about 9% is composted, and then the remaining is managed through waste-to-energy facilities or incinerators. Okay, another chart that might be a little bit hard to see, but this is, again, OECD waste management techniques. And this is ordered in highest to lowest by landfills. So a lot of you have probably been exposed to European perspectives on waste management strategies. So in this chart, on the left-hand side is the open dumps, and it shows Peru and Brazil, Chile, and Costa Rica as OECD countries that still have open dumps. None of the other OECD countries on this list have any. But sanitary landfills, up at the top there is New Zealand, with 100% of their waste being managed through sanitary landfills. And then you get down to the bottom here with some of the European countries, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, Japan and Denmark and Belgium, all handling 1% or less as the waste, as landfills being the primary management. So the US and Australia are both up there at over 50%. And so one of the things we talked a little bit about is large open land being a primary consideration for when you decide to manage your waste through landfills. And Australia is, of course, another country very similar to the US in having large land areas that can be utilized for sanitary landfills. So over time, things have not been static. We haven't been doing exactly the same thing. Our waste generation has continued to go up, and that's because we do have a growing population. However, our waste did peak in around 2000, so on a per person, per capita basis. But waste generation continues to go up, and that's additional material that we have to manage on an annual basis. Our recycling rate also started off pretty low. If you look at 1960, we were recycling less than 10%, and then we had a big jump in the 1990s as waste recycling programs started to grow. And part of the reason those recycling programs started to grow is, as Jim pointed out, as we closed the open dumps and we lost that free source of disposal, suddenly recycling for some of the commodities became economically viable. And so as that became economically viable, a lot of the materials started to get recycled. But this is recycling that has a market. And previously, it may not have been viable because you could take it to the open dump at no cost. And maybe there was a market, but it still costs some processing and collection costs, and that exceeded the free dumping. As landfills started to come into effect, even municipal landfills, they pretty much all started charging tip fees or gate fees. That means as trash would come across the gate, everybody was charging tip fees. So when I started working, we operated at a facility, we had an open dump that was operated at no cost to the residents. They could come and dump their material. It was free. It was all part of their, included in their taxes. As the regulations started taking effect and we realized it was going to cost a lot more to operate a facility, we wanted to encourage diversion activities, and we also wanted to have a funding source to be able to operate our landfill. We started charging initially a tip fee of $18 a ton and then eventually $40 a ton. And on average in the United States, tip fees at landfills are about $50 a ton nationally. It varies significantly from one part of the country to the next. The lowest areas probably in the western part of the United States, but not near the coast, just the western part, like Utah, Colorado, probably in the high teens per ton, like $19, $20 a ton. And then in the coastal areas and in the Northeast in particular, we're paying pretty high tip fees of about $80 a ton. Your waste management strategies change significantly when you're confronted with different prices. So here is our generation on a commodity basis. As you can see, I talked a little bit about paper and cardboard being our primary material, waste material that was generated. And you can see that kind of peaked in 2000. So that blue line that you see above all the other lines is paper and cardboard. in the United States. And so as newspapers started to decline, we started to see that number drop significantly. So then that kind of is starting to flatten out a little bit. That's probably Amazon. So a lot of people are getting cardboard boxes shipped to their houses on a daily basis, and so that's increasing the cardboard. But chances are that's going to change again as we start to see Amazon moving to different products and trying to reduce their packaging. So this might be a temporary thing, but who knows? The behavior of consumers changes very rapidly. So then we have what is recovered. So this is recycling and composting. That tall line, once again, that's plastic. So I'm sorry, that's paper. So once again, paper is the largest amount that's recovered out of the waste stream. So we generate a lot of paper and cardboard, but we also recycle a lot of paper and cardboard. That second line there is yard waste. So all the grass and things that are cut, and so a lot of that is also recovered, which leads to what actually ends up in the landfill. So this is what ends up in the landfill. So you see that blue line again is the primary thing that was generated, and for a long time it was the primary thing that was in the landfill. But at this point it's dropped to number 3. And that green line that is at the top at the very end, that's food. So the primary thing that's going into our landfills is food waste, and then the second line there is plastics. Plastics have been growing as a waste stream over time, and it is now the second largest component of our landfills. This is one of the things that as you come up with your treatment technology, you have to understand that it's not static. You can't plan for something to be your waste stream today, because it's going to be not the same thing 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. You're going to need to have a flexible system that's going to be able to adjust to consumers' changing behaviors. Okay, so then here is what is recycled material-wise. As you could see, I talked about a lot of the paper and plastic paper was recovered, and so about 67% of all the recycling that's done in the United States is paper and paperboard. So that's your paper and cardboard. And then the second largest amount up there is metals, so aluminum, iron, things like that. So then what ends up being landfilled? This is just a snapshot view. You saw the view over time. So this is the current snapshot, the end view, which shows that the largest component is food. But as you saw previously, that's just now, and that could change tomorrow. So Jim kind of went a little over some of our regulations. As I said, EPA, we have RCRA Subtitle C and Subtitle D. Subtitle D is what is considered your homeowner and commercial waste. We have CERCLA. So a lot of those open dumps that we have were polluting the groundwater, and we needed to have a mechanism in place to be able to clean up those sites. And that was very expensive. So RCRA is called CERCLA. It's the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So what that does is it goes after those sites, and it goes after the owners of the site as well as anybody that ever contributed anything to those sites, and they charge them back the money. So the federal government is responsible for the cleanup, but then they try and recover all the expenses of the cleanup by approaching everybody that ever contributed anything. Even if you sent just a truckload of waste to one of those sites 10 years ago, if they have a record that you did that, they'll go after you. So that was one of the ways that the U.S. government ensured the cleanup of a lot of those Superfund sites and ensured that the polluters were the ones that paid for the cleanup. We also have our new source performance standards, NSPS, which controls the air regulations. So all the landfills also reduce their climate impacts by collecting and controlling their landfill gas. And then states are responsible for certain waste streams that the federal government does not have any responsibility for, and that includes construction and demolition debris waste, regulated medical waste, land clearing debris, and recycling and composting has no federal regulation governing it. So any recycling regulation that you hear about in the United States is simply state regulations. So we have a bunch of local drivers that are really important to understand. Again, you have to understand the current state of the waste management. Without understanding what you're currently doing, you can't move from that, how it's collected, where it goes, and what it's made of. Because there's been a number of failures even within the United States where people decide that they want to do waste conversion technology or implement new technologies, and they've become failures because they failed to estimate the amount of materials or be able to adjust for the changing material stream. And then one of the big factors that a lot of people don't consider is the value of fuel and energy. If you're going to be transporting materials for long distance, you're really going to have to consider the transportation costs associated with that. For example, in the United States, glass recycling is something that everybody wants to do, but there aren't that many glass bottling facilities, so you're going to be transporting things over very long distances, and glass is a very heavy material. So at what point does the environmental benefit of recycling glass get outweighed by the environmental costs of the fossil fuels that you're using to transport that same glass? And that's a calculation that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. If you have a facility that's right adjacent to a glass bottling plant, well, then it seems like it makes all the sense in the world. If you're transporting it 500 miles, perhaps it's not the best consideration. And then what's the value of energy? If you're going to have a waste-to-energy plant in Europe where you're paying hundreds of dollars, large amounts of money, 15, 16 cents per kilowatt of energy, that might make sense. In the United States, it's 3 to 4 cents a kilowatt of energy. So it no longer makes sense. You can't have a waste-to-energy facility that effectively makes money. And so then the last thing on the landfills, Jim hit on this a little bit, is we need to make sure our landfills are appropriately designed and managed in order to protect the environment and to make the distinction between what is a landfill and what's an open dump. These are the things that make it different. You have to have the location restrictions in place, and you can't place them just anywhere. You also need to make sure that you have, for us, composite liners, which has both a synthetic liner that's made of plastic as well as clay. We have leachate collection. Without the collecting the leachate, that liner is not worth anything. You need to collect it and you need to treat it. You need to have appropriate operations practice to control the receipt of the waste and control the operations. So you can't have hundreds of people on the landfill that are going to be disturbing your system. It needs to be covered on a daily basis. You need to control the animals that are allowed in, and all these things contribute to being able to reduce the disease and reduce the potential impacts. And then you need to monitor your groundwater. The groundwater monitoring is done just to confirm that your leachate system is operating. For the most part, your groundwater monitoring is going to basically prove that everything's operating appropriately. Your liner system is your safeguard. This is your confirm but verify. And then, if necessary, you have to have the ability to take corrective action. So there needs to be enforcement mechanisms in place, and the local governments or the state governments or the federal government needs to be able to come in, do routine inspections. They need to be able to come in and enforce their regulations, and they have to be able to be empowered to do that. And then finally, at the end of the life for the landfill, you need to be able to close it appropriately and have post-closure monitoring. In the United States, it's a minimum of 30 years after the landfill is closed that you have to do post-closure monitoring. Obviously, all our large companies would like to see that reduced, but they have to take additional steps if they want to do something to be able to demonstrate that they have satisfactorily proved that that landfill is safe in perpetuity. And then finally, this last thing is a financial assurance mechanism. What if a private company operates a landfill and that private company were to go out of business? This is how the local government or the state government is assured that they still don't have to worry. There has to be financial assurance mechanisms in place, whether it's a bond, whether it's putting up the money to ensure that that post-closure care costs are taken care of. This way you ensure that those facilities don't become Superfund liabilities after the fact. So that's all I have for, I do have a typical cross-section. I think you have this in one of the handouts, not this exact one, but a similar one, which basically covers some of the same things that we discussed. And then the rest of my presentations for this afternoon, so thank you.